The second part of the Scrum framework will be the Scrum Events. So we have 3 Scrum roles: the product owner, the development team, and the Scrum Master. And we have 5 events as per the Scrum framework. Prescribed events are used in Scrum to create regularity and to minimize the need for meetings not defined in Scrum. So same applies to the Scrum events. In the Scrum roles, we mentioned that we have only 3 roles. We cannot add to them. We cannot eliminate any of them. Here also we have 5 Scrum events which we need to commit to. Other than the sprint itself, which is the container for all other events, each event in Scrum is a formal opportunity to inspect and adapt something. So we will utilize the Scrum events to apply the Scrum pillars of inspection and adaptation. The events are designed to enable critical transparency, inspection, regularity, and adaptation. We prefer to use these predefined meetings with fixed objectives and maximize durations instead of ad hoc meetings, which most likely waste our time. So the Scrum events were founded in the Scrum framework just to avoid any ad hoc meetings and to avoid any waste of time or efforts. So the container for all the Scrum events will be the sprint itself, which usually 2 to 4 weeks in duration. The first event is the sprint planning meeting, the one at the early phases of the sprint. And then we will have the daily Scrum meeting, or known as the daily stand-up. We will have the sprint review meeting at the end of the sprint to demonstrate the increment we built. And finally, we will have the sprint retrospective meeting. These are the 5 events: the sprint, sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, and sprint retrospective. We need to commit to these 5 events and make sure the 5 events are happening as part of each sprint. At a high level, the sprint in each Scrum project, it's a set of, or each Scrum project is a group of sprints. Each Scrum project is a set of sprints. Sprint is a container for the other 4 events: development effort and the maintenance of the product backlog. So the other 4 events all occur or all happen as part of the sprint itself. The sprint planning meeting is the first event inside a sprint. So once we start a sprint, we will start by planning of what we are going to deliver at the end of each of this sprint. The Scrum team plans the items they are going to deliver in the sprint and the way they will deliver those items. So who is responsible for planning for the sprint and what we are going to deliver at the end of the sprint? It's the responsibility of the development team. They are self-managed, self-organized, and they are able to decide what they can deliver at the end of the sprint. The third event will be the daily Scrum. The development team starts working on the objectives of the sprint as soon as the sprint planning is completed. At the end of the sprint planning meeting, we will have the sprint backlog. It's the backlog of the sprint itself, which is part of the product backlog. During this time, the execution time, the Scrum team holds a daily meeting, normally 15 minutes, to coordinate the work for the next 24 hours, which is called the daily stand-up or the daily Scrum. So in this meeting, each development team member will mention what he did in the previous time, what impediments he or she is facing, and what he or she is planning to do in the upcoming 24 hours. At the end of the sprint, we will demonstrate the increment we built in the sprint review meeting. Before the end of the sprint, the development team presents the outcome of the sprint to the customer and receives feedback. This meeting is known as the sprint review or the sprint demo. We just want to demonstrate what we did in this sprint to the customer, obtain their feedback, and reflect on their feedback for the upcoming sprint. Now, to gather the lessons learned at the end of the sprint, we will conduct the sprint retrospective. Just before the sprint is over, the development team holds an internal meeting to review the sprint and use it to improve the process in the next sprint, and this is known as the sprint retrospective. It's something similar to the lessons learned workshops that are conducted as part of the traditional approaches. There is an essential concept in Agile methods in general, not only in the Scrum, known as the time box. The time box can be defined as a predefined fixed maximum duration of time. So if we say that the time box of the daily stand-up is 15 minutes, the daily stand-up should finish in 15 minutes. The second day and the third day and the fourth day stand-ups also should finish in 15 minutes. This is the time box. In order to maximize productivity, all of the Scrum events must be time boxed. So as I am explaining the Scrum events in this lecture, you will notice that there is a fixed time box for each of these events. A time box is a fixed period of time in which we freeze the target and work with full focus on certain tasks or objectives. Time-boxed events repeat many times until the final goal of those events is achieved. All the changes are applied only when one time box is finished and we are ready to start the next one. So we cannot change or modify anything before the time box is completed. The duration of a time box should be agreed upon and fixed. We are free to change the duration based on lessons learned, but not frequently and never based on single occasions. So we can adapt or modify the time box, but it should be based on lessons learned, not just based on a single event or someone's opinion. For example, we are not allowed to say that we have a lot to do this time, so let's increase the duration of this Scrum event. It's not allowed. What we are allowed to say is based on the previous 10 meetings or 10 time boxes, we realized that the duration of our time boxes is not suitable and a 30% increase in duration might better fit our needs, so let's increase them from now on. This is how a time box can be changed, not only based on a single occasion or someone's opinion. It should be changed based on a clear thinking and decision. Now, the first event, which is the container of the other 4 events, is the sprint itself. A sprint can be defined as a time box of 1 month or less during which a done, usable, and potentially releasable product increment is created. This is the definition of the sprint. It's a time box of usually 1 month, it can be less, which a done, increment, or usable and potentially releasable product, which is an increment part of the product, is created at the end of this sprint. An increment is developed in each sprint, and an increment can be defined as a potentially releasable part of the final product, a sum of all product backlog items completed in a specific sprint and its previous sprints. So increments are accumulative. It is what we completed at the specific sprint and its previous sprints. So for a sprint to be successful, an increment should be produced at the end of it. An increment can be considered a minor revision of the product with few features and functionalities. Exactly. So we are just developing a software, for example. At the end of each sprint, we are adding 1 or 2 features or functions to this software. This is an increment. An increment may or may not be released at the end of the sprint, but it must be potentially releasable. So even if it was not officially released to the market or it is not full releasable increment, it should be potentially releasable. Customers usually request changes when they see the increment in the sprint review or the sprint demo meeting, and we apply changes in the product backlog and make sure these changes are implemented in the upcoming sprint. So, for example, you finished a sprint and you produced an increment, and then you finished another sprint and you produced increment number 3, and so on. The important point is that we do not change the items of the sprint backlog after the sprint is started and the plans are set. This is very important. We usually do not change the items we selected to execute as part of this sprint, which we documented in the sprint backlog. Once the sprint starts, the plans are set, we cannot change the sprint backlog items. The sprint goal should not change at all either. You might need to cancel a sprint if the goal of this sprint is not valid or achievable anymore. The product owner and the development team might try to clarify and renegotiate the scope as more is learned, but will not change the sprint backlog. Even the composition of the development team should not change during a sprint. These constraints are designed to make it possible to focus and get things done. So it's highly recommended not to change the sprint backlog items once a sprint starts, and not to change the configuration of the development team. Each item or user story in the product backlog should normally be developed, completed in a single sprint, as this is the much easier to manage. And we will talk about this concept later on in the Agile sections. Usually when we have a user story, we will decompose this user story if it was a large size user story. Now, what's the reference for decomposition? We want to make sure that this user story in size can be realized and achieved in one single sprint. The product owner and the development team select a number of items from the top of the product backlog. Why the top of the product backlog? Because the backlog is prioritized based on the expected value, and aim to get them done 100% or complete at the end of the sprint. We want them to be really done when the sprint is over, and create an increment that is releasable or potentially releasable. An increment is the sum of all the completed items during a sprint and all the previous sprints. This is why the concept is accumulative. It's important to agree on a definition of done at the beginning of the project. We will not call something done unless it fits its definition. And the definition of done is one of the Scrum artifacts we will cover later on, and it's a shared agreement across all the stakeholders in the development team and the Scrum team that this item is completed. This is the definition of done. A criteria that should be achieved in a specific item to make sure it is completed. An increment is the sum of all completed items during a sprint and previous sprints. It's important to agree in this definition of done at the early phases of the project. We will not call something done unless it fits its definition. Even a 99.9999% completed item is not considered a done. It's either 0 or 1. It would not be part of the increment, and it will not be demonstrated to the customer at the sprint review meeting. So to consider something done, it's either 0 or 1, either 0 or 100. Now, what is the sprint time box? Most companies, organizations use sprint time boxes of 2 to 4 weeks. And the commonly used duration or time box is 1 month or 4 weeks. If we use time boxes longer than 1 calendar month for sprints, it will be likely for the unapplied changes to become large enough to create problems. So we need to be frequent in sprints as much as possible to be able to inspect and adapt on a frequent basis. Our goal is to deliver the final product item by item inside the sprints. We do not want to split a single product backlog item among several sprints. So if it is a single product backlog item or a user story, it should be in size and implemented maximum in 1 sprint. Sprint cancellation. The only responsible role or accountable role to cancel a sprint is the product owner. Even though each sprint is frozen and does not change, the product owner is the only role who has the authority to cancel a sprint. This can happen when the sprint goal becomes obsolete due to changes in the product backlog, changes in strategies or approach. When a sprint is cancelled, the items that are done will be reviewed and accepted, and the rest of the items will be put back into the product backlog to be done and reprioritized in the future. So these are the situations when a sprint can be cancelled, and the product owner is the only role who has the authority to take such decision. Now, the development team does not wait until the product backlog is 100% planned to start developing the project. As soon as the product backlog is mature enough to guide us through the near future, the product owner and the development team can start the first sprint. So we should not wait the product owner to fully develop and prioritize the product backlog. Just having enough to start or enough maturity for the product backlog will allow the development team to kick off the first sprint in the project, and this by conducting the sprint planning meeting. This is the first event within the container of a sprint. The sprint planning can be defined as a time-boxed meeting, usually fixed to 8 hours for a 1-month sprint. So if the sprint is in duration up to 4 weeks, the sprint planning meeting will usually be fixed to 8 hours. It can be shorter for sprints of less than 1 month. All 3 roles should attend this meeting: the development team, the Scrum Master, and the product owner. The sprint planning meeting will answer the following questions: what can be delivered in the increment resulting from the upcoming sprint? How will the work needed to deliver the increment be achieved? So the key role in or the contribution, the major contribution to the sprint planning meeting will be from the development team, as they should answer these questions. The product owner prioritized the product backlog items and made it clear for the development team what are the items we want to focus on, what are the items with the highest possible value to the customer, but the development team need to select from these items the items that they believe they can commit to deliver during the upcoming sprint. So these are the 2 questions that should be answered at the end of the sprint planning meeting. Development team should estimate the capacity of work it can deliver in a single sprint. The product owner has already ranked and ordered the product backlog items based on the value of the user stories. The product owner also ensures that the items are easy to understand. It's the responsibility of the product owner to make sure that all user stories are well written and they are easy to understand. So the development team should estimate the capacity. They are able to select the items they believe they can deliver as part of the sprint. Product owner is responsible of prioritizing the backlog, and the Scrum Master in this meeting is responsible to promote Scrum and make sure the team is achieving the sprint planning meeting objectives. The development team then selects an appropriate number of items from the top of the product backlog and puts them in the sprint backlog. As an outcome of the sprint planning meeting, we will have the sprint backlog to deliver in the current sprint. The sprint backlog is part of the product backlog with the items we will deliver during this sprint. The amount of work for each item is estimated by the development team, and the total amount of work of the selected items is close to the estimated capacity of the development team. As the development team is self-managed and self-organized, they are responsible to select the items they are capable to produce. Following the selection of the items for the current or the upcoming sprint, the Scrum team should craft a sprint goal, which is an objective that should be met within the sprint through the implementation of the product backlog. So the sprint goal is what the development team wants to achieve at the end of this sprint. The sprint goal provides guidance to the development team on why they are building this specific increment. So after deciding which product backlog items they want to commit to develop in this sprint or upcoming sprint to produce the increment potentially releasable to the customer, the development team should define the sprint goal, which is the reason of why they are developing this increment. The scope of the sprint, which is made up of the items selected from the product backlog, might need addition of some details through the sprint. These details should be aligned with the sprint goal, and likely renegotiations should be done in presence of the product owner. The sprint goal is also included as part of the sprint backlog. So the team can refine, can progressively elaborate when more information is available for them about the user stories they selected to develop as part of this sprint. When the items to deliver are selected and the sprint goal is agreed, it's the time to plan how they will turn the items or the user stories into a done product increment and realize the sprint goal. And this is considered as the last part of the sprint backlog, where the development team will detail the activities and the tasks they will execute in order to develop the desired increment. This planning is not necessarily completed in the sprint planning meeting. Having a detailed plan for the first few days is enough. The development team can prepare detailed plans for the list of the work later on, which is the concept of the rolling wave planning and progressive elaboration. The team can start by planning in detail for the upcoming few days, and then when more information is available, they can refine and detail the remaining work of the sprint. A detailed plan is a breakdown of a product backlog item into detailed tasks needed to be done in order to create this item. Each task might have estimates, dependencies, and similar information to make tracking possible. So the idea here is decomposing each user story or each product backlog item into a group of tasks with the estimates, dependencies, and level of effort required to execute each of these tasks. The sprint backlog will be ready at the end of this meeting, and the development team should be able to describe what items they will deliver through the sprint and how they will do it. So the outcomes of the sprint planning meeting is having a sprint backlog, including the items or the user stories the team will execute in the upcoming sprint, in addition to the sprint goal and how they are going to execute this. There is no specific rule on documenting, storing, and presenting the sprint backlog. It can be written on a whiteboard similar to the one in the following figure. So simply, this is a sprint backlog, or this is one of the formats or the methods you can use to document the sprint backlog. Here is the sprint goal documented. Here are the items from the product backlog or the user stories the team decided to commit to execute in this sprint, and here are the tasks as each of these user stories are broken down into a group of tasks. Yellow sticky notes on the above board or this board are the tasks that are created by breaking down each of the user stories or each of the product backlog items. These tasks define what the development team will do to deliver each item, and they are responsible for preparing them. So it's the responsibility, the full responsibility of the development team to select the items and break down the items into a group of tasks. Some tasks are created at the sprint planning meeting, and some other tasks are created throughout the sprint. The sprint backlog as a conclusion consists of the following: the sprint goal, why the team will create a specific increment at the end of the sprint. The second component is selected items from the product backlog that will be delivered through the sprint. And the third component is a detailed plan for turning the selected items into done increment of the product and to realize the sprint goal. So it's the goal, the items from the product backlog, and the detailed plans. This sample Scrum board has also extra features for tracking the tasks and items in to do, doing, and done columns. So this is a simple task board which we will explain in detail later on. One of the commonly used information radiators in Agile and Scrum projects. This is known as the task board, showing at the very basic level 3 columns: to do, doing, and done. The next figure shows the same sprint after the first item is complete and items number 2 and 3 are in progress. So in our case, in this example, comparing to the previous board I showed you in the previous slide, we have now item number 1 or user story number 1 in the done column. It was completed, and currently the team is working on item number 2 or user story number 2. Some of the tasks of this item are completed, some in the progress and some in the to-do column. You can also see that extra tasks have been added to the lower ranked items, which is the ongoing detail planning done through the sprint. So we added more tasks under some of the user stories, and this is the progressive elaboration. If you want to start your sprint, having detailed plans or having the tasks at least for items number 1 and 2 are enough, and then we can refine and detail the other user stories. The second event or meeting is the daily Scrum, which is normally a 15-minute meeting for the development team to inspect the work since the last meeting and synchronize their work and plan for the next 24 hours. It must be held on daily basis. So this meeting is for the development team with the Scrum Master. Simply the team will answer 3 questions: what you did in the last 24 hours, are you facing any impediments or challenges, and what you are going to do in the upcoming 24 hours. Stand-up meeting daily for 15 minutes. During the daily Scrum, each member of the development team should answer 3 questions. What has been accomplished since the last meeting, the last daily stand-up? what will be done before the next meeting, and what obstacles are in your way or what support you are seeking for. This is why it's only a 15-minute meeting. So if you have a team of 9 development team members, each one will answer these 3 questions in 1 or 2 minutes. The daily Scrum meeting should be held at the same time, at the same place throughout the sprint to minimize this meeting complexity. It is just for the development team. It's not a status meeting for all stakeholders. So it's only for the development team members, and usually the Scrum Master will be available to promote the Scrum or this Scrum practice and to facilitate the discussions between the development team members. The development team should also monitor the sprint progress each day, and therefore it's a good idea for the sprint board to be visible during the daily Scrum meeting. As this sketch in front of you, they are having here the sprint board showing what is or what was done, what's in progress, and what is in the to-do list. They can use a burn down chart, which is again one of the commonly used information radiators, which we will cover later on in this course. They can use the burn down chart to track their remaining work and check to see if they are going to complete all items before the end of the sprint or not. So the burn down chart will show the remaining work on the project, and it's a very useful information radiator. The below figure now contains the sprint burn down chart, and this can be updated after each daily Scrum meeting. Burn down charts are discussed further in the next section. So same task board or same sprint board showing the sprint goal and the user stories and the tasks. We just added the sprint burn down chart. So we can see here that the remaining work on the project is getting lower, as this chart will track the remaining work, not the completed work, the remaining work. This linear line represents the planned plan, okay, and the planned progress, and this red line represents the actual progress. I will explain the burn down chart later on in this course. Another Scrum event is the sprint review that is held at the end of the sprint to inspect the increment and adapt the product backlog if needed. So mainly the sprint review or the sprint demo meeting is a demonstration meeting for the development team to present what they did and the increment they developed in this sprint, to obtain feedback and to adapt based on the received feedback from the stakeholders. During the sprint review, the Scrum team and stakeholders collaborate about what was done in the sprint. Based on that and any changes to the product backlog during the sprint, attendees collaborate on the next things that could be done to optimize value. So the idea of having a sprint review or a sprint demo is to demonstrate the increment the team built at the end of this sprint and obtain feedback and reflect and plan for the upcoming sprints. This is an informal meeting. It's not a status meeting, and the presentation of the increment is intended to elicit feedback and foster collaboration. So the key purpose of having the sprint review or the sprint demo meeting is to obtain feedback and foster collaboration. This is at most a 4-hour meeting for 1 month sprint. So the sprint planning meeting is 8 hours for a 1 month sprint. The daily stand-up is a 15 minutes meeting, and the sprint review is a 4-hour meeting. For shorter sprints, this event is usually shorter. The Scrum Master ensures that the event takes place and that attendees understand its purpose. This is the role of the Scrum Master in this meeting, and the Scrum Master will teach everyone involved to keep it within the time box. So is responsible to facilitate the meeting and make sure the meeting achieves its objectives and it is conducted within the intended time box. It's the responsibility of the Scrum Master. So the product owner will communicate the project status with the customers based on the increment demo. So the responsible for facilitating the discussions between the customers and the development team is the product owner. The product owner will communicate the feedback of the customers in business terminology to the development team, and the development team with the product owner will make sure this feedback is reflected in the upcoming sprints. The sprint review meeting includes attendees including the Scrum team and key stakeholders invited by the product owner. The product owner explains what product backlog items have been done and what has not been done. The development team discusses what went well during the sprint, what problems it ran into, and how those problems were solved. The development team demonstrates the work that it has done and answers questions about the increment, and the product owner will discuss the current status of the product backlog items. All these are activities executed as part of the sprint review event. The sprint retrospective is an opportunity for the Scrum team to inspect itself and create a plan for improvements to be enacted during the next sprint. So think about the sprint retrospective as a lessons learned gathering workshop where the development team will discuss opportunities to improve their performance, and also they will identify things they want to avoid in the future. The sprint retrospective occurs after the sprint review and prior to the next sprint planning meeting. So it's the last meeting conducted in the sprint, and it is prior to the next sprint planning meeting. It is usually 3 to 4 hour meeting for a 1 month sprint, and of course for shorter sprints the event is usually shorter. The Scrum Master will attend this meeting to ensure that the event takes place and that attendants understand the sprint retrospective purpose. The Scrum Master ensures that the meeting is positive and productive. The Scrum Master teaches all to keep it within the time box. The Scrum Master participates as a peer team member in the meeting from the accountability over the Scrum process. So not only the development team members, even the Scrum Master will have a valuable input to this process, participating as a peer team member. Now the purpose of the sprint retrospective is to inspect how the last sprint went with regards to people, relationships, process, and tools, to identify and order the major items that went well and potential improvements, and to create a plan for implementing improvements to the way the Scrum team does its work. So these are the key purposes of conducting the sprint retrospective. We want to inspect what we did in the last sprint. We want to identify the items that went well, and we want to create a plan for implementing improvements. The Scrum Master encourages the Scrum team to improve within the Scrum process framework, its development process and practices, to make it more effective and enjoyable for the next sprint. So we don't want the sprint retrospective to turn into a very formal and strict meeting. We want to make it enjoyable and effective. The sprint retrospective will be covered again in more detail in the continuous reflection in Agile section.